Well, I'm just delighted to introduce Sierra today. Sierra grew up in Oregon and Hawaii. That sounds like a great combo. Beats the hell out of upstate New York. But anyway, and then went to college at Georgetown, medical school at Oregon. And of course, we were very, very fortunate to recruit her here. I remember interviewing you as a medical student. She's heading to New Mexico for one of the premier urogynecology fellowships where, yeah, woo! And I'm particularly thrilled, not only because it's a great urogynecology program, but they have amazing family planning there. The chair there is Eve Espy, who's really just been a warrior in terms of family planning in the last 20 years in this country. So Sierra, welcome. Here we go. Give her another hand.
Turn this on. Can you guys hear me okay? Sweet. Oh, there are more of you today. All right. Good morning. I'm really excited to be here. As a background, this is a topic that caught my eye when I was an undergrad, and one of the reasons I went into medical school and became a doctor and got me into OB-GYN and urogyn. It's also a topic that has got a lot of media attention over the past decade or so, and there's still a lot to be done. So I kind of want to go over a few of the things that we can do and shed some light on this issue today. I have no disclosures to report, not getting paid. More than happy to take any, obviously. Love that joke. And here are my objectives. I hope by the end of this talk you have kind of a basic understanding of what GU fistula is, some typical patterns of acquisition, and kind of the history of fistula surgery here in the US as well as in Europe, and kind of where we've gotten to where we are now. Finally, I want to talk about the global burden of disease caused by fistula and the detrimental impact this has on human lives as well as economic impacts. And I hope to end being done with kind of what is being done in these different countries to fix this issue and what we have to do going forward. So this is a quote that I found from J.Y. Simpson, who was a gynecologist in the 1800s. It kind of captures the magnitude of GU fistula or obstetric fistula in that time period. And kind of the despair, I think, is really what I want to focus on. So what is a fistula? I have a couple pictures of vaginas in this talk, I'm sorry, but I figure it's an OB-GYN audience, so we're okay with that. This is basically the definition for Williams. A fistula is an aberrant connection between two epithelial surfaces. As you can see here, this is a small fistula. The dilator is exposing both ends. Some of these heal spontaneously, but in many cases these require surgical repair. There are a lot of risk factors for persistence, and one is the extent of epithelial cross-union, the size, the location, and also the extent of necrotic tissue and surrounding. I also want to say for the most part in this talk, I'm going to be focusing more on obstetric fistula rather than kind of the whole encompassing GYN fistula, GU fistula, but I will touch on some other things as well. There are also different kind of types based on the two kind of surfaces that are connected. They can be vesicovaginal, they can be rectovaginal, they can be uterovaginal, they can kind of just go everywhere. So this is obstetric fistula. Obstetric fistula is a consequence of pressure necrosis following a difficult labor. And difficult is also something that is pretty relative. Here in the US, we have criteria for pushing an arrest up to sign criteria of hours. For many of these women in different countries with lack of care, this can be on the magnitude of days. There was one story that I read that it was actually that they were pushing for about 15 days. That was the longest that I saw, but it did seem like quite a long extent of time and a lot of damage. And Mafuz, who was an obstetrician in Ghana, also noted that there were some different risk factors for this. So adolescence was one of them, neglected shoulders were one of them, malaria was another one, malnutrition was one as well, and then destructive forceps was another thing that they talked about all so long, which kind of goes along with the obstructive labor curve. But really the main thing that ran across throughout everything was the impact of absent medical care for a lot of these obstetric fistula patients. Briefly, we have kind of a histological slide. This is a vesicovaginal fistula that I found online. So we as surgeons are able to excise the fistulas, but really the accurate diagnosis is made histologically. And here, let's see if I can work this button. Oh, hold on. Shoot. Well, maybe, oh wait, hold it down. So you can see the epithelial cells here, sorry, here and here. And then you see in the background, you see this kind of acute on chronic inflammation that's there. You can also see on the H&E stain here, there's a little bit of yellow here, and that is increased lymphocytes, and then fibrin is that as well. So those are the things that you can see. And it really takes a pathologist to look at these. So, time for the history of this. Obstetric fistula has been known about for a long time. This is a quote from the Ebers Papyrus. This is a medical and an herbal text that has a couple different sections. And they have an obstetrical and gynecological section that talks about abnormal uterine bleeding. It talks about labor, things to bring on labor, but it also talks about fistula. This was also initially from around 2050 BC, but was translated in 1872. And it was found close to the mummy of Henhenit. Who is this? So this, I think, was a really interesting thing that I found. So this is the mummy of Henhenit. She was a lady in the court of Mentuhotep, I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's actually a really interesting preserved mummy of a obstetrical fistula. So what you can see is this, left for you guys, image, oh shoot, is the vesicovaginal fistula. So you can see here there's an excessive AP diameter, and you can also see kind of the rupture of the bladder into the vagina. You see the kind of thickened necrosed tissue right over there, and this is where the vagina should be, and the bladder is just extended into it. And then if you look on the back, you can also see a few different things. So you can see an enlarged anus, a perineal tear, probably a third or fourth degree, we don't know. And then what they saw in the vagina, which I thought was really interesting, was they saw a lot of increased fibrin uptake and kind of resin uptake, which shows, for archaeologists, a concern for infection and a lot of thickened necrosed tissue, so kind of secondary to a fistula. Also another quote from Avicenna. This is an Arabo Persian physician who was working in the early 11th century, and he noted the following quote. And the ways to prevent pregnancy at that time were kind of along the lines of goatskin condoms. We've obviously changed and are now doing more alerts and other things, but really the same principles apply, and we should kind of work on that. So, to get to how we were able to start fixing things. This was one of the first operative gynecology books. This was from a Dutch physician, Hendrik van Roonhuysen, and he discussed the following principles below for closure, which are somewhat similar and some are different now as well, but really exposure of the speculum, denudation of the bladder wall, stitching some needles made out of stiff swan's quill, which I thought was interesting, and then some plasters to hold everything together, which were wicks of worm oil. Mainly, the pioneering theory about this was that he was one of the first people to use swan's quills over the golden needles and silver needles that they were using at the time, which they were also using to repair cleft palates. So, to go forward a little bit, Johann Fatio was working around 1752, and he was an Italian physician. He was one of the first to have had 2 successful repairs by this previously documented technique. However, Joseph Lamel, who was working in US and also in France, in 1836 was one of the first who was noted to have a successful fistula repair. And this was after a lot of failures. He tried a lot of different things to get this to work. Also tried some different grafting techniques as well, which I'll get to, but was ultimately unsuccessful with that. So one can't have a discussion of obstetric fistula without J. Marion Sims. He was previously a discussion of ran rounds about 2 years ago by Dr. Barnes, and there are a lot of articles and papers and media attention on J. Marion Sims right now. Indeed, there's no longer an OGS lecture series named after him because of the concern for questionable ethics. This is a picture that I found. It's hanging up at SIU, the School of Medicine, and you might recognize it, you might not. This is Sims, who's over here with 2 medical students, and then Lucy and Anarco over here, and Betsy. and those are his 3 slaves. So Betsy's pictured here on the operating table, underwent over 30 operations without any anesthesia, though ether was available at the time. Also, there was concerns for consent, and she also needed to be restrained during the procedures. Per much the historical record that I read, why they weren't using ether was unclear. Many state that this was secondary to the belief that African Americans could not feel pain at this time. However, if you read his autobiography, you see that all 3 of these women were in pretty excruciating pain throughout the procedures. So really, one cannot have had success without the teenagers who were all, I think they were 16, 17, and 18 when everything started. So without these 3 women. And this contribution really needs to be recognized, especially in the kind of context of the medical apartheid that exists right now. So despite these questionable practices, J. Marion Sims was really one of the first to effectively pioneer techniques to allow for the kind of successful closure of fistula alongside Joseph van Bell. He had a seminal paper. It was made in 1852, and he discussed his treatment options. Mainly, he was actually one of the first who consistently used a speculum to be able to visualize these fistulae. His first speculum was actually a pewter spoon that he then, throughout the years, kind of modified to have it be more effective than just a large spoon. But there's some really great quotes about him being able to actually visualize everything accurately for the first time. And he ultimately moved from Alabama, where he was practicing, to New York City in the 1850s. And he set up a women's hospital. This is a drawing that I found of the women's hospital. It looks kind of like Madeline to me. And it's actually now at the site of the Waldorf Astoria, which I think is kind of cool. This opened in May 4th of 1855. Had 30 beds in it. It was funded actually by the Women's League because he couldn't get anyone else to pay for it. And within the first week, all of the beds were filled. He operated with 2 people mainly, his 2 proteges. They were Nathan Bozeman and Thomas Emmett. And they really were to effectively improve on a lot of the techniques that Sims did. They operated with him most of the time and kept meticulous detail of each of the operations that they did. Nathan Bozeman actually also devised a self-retracting and also a holding, what's the word I'm looking for here, a self-restraining stool that they could sit on. So the 2 medical assistants who were assisting during surgery no longer had to hold patients down. So that kind of freed up a lot of people. A couple other people, they also obviously did the silver wire, so we go back to using silver wire as suture, instead of using the bone spicules or foil that were previously being used. There are a couple of other people who I won't mention, but are well mentioned very briefly. Dupuytren, Maison, Collis, and Lasco also really worked a lot to pioneer new techniques in the world of fistula surgery. So grafting is another thing that has helped in a lot of these fistula surgeries. This was really helpful if there's areas of really large swaths of necrosed tissues. So Van Bell, who we talked about, initially started using some labial skin as a graft to plug the fistula, which had mixed results. There were a few other things that people used. He tried placental tissue from a stillborn 5-month child. That did not work. He thought it was going to be secondary to the regenerative capacity. That was there. He tried kind of gracilis flaps or omental flaps with Kyokuta, and those sometimes worked, but not obviously, and also required abdominal incision for some of them. But Martius, who was in Göttingen, Germany, was one of the few who really effectively found a way to pioneer flaps and did so in 1928. He had a seminal paper, which is in German, and I'm not going to pronounce it for you guys because I can't speak German very well. But basically what it does, as you can see here, is it takes a pad flap and just brings it over the fistula. And this basically obliterates some of the dead space that is surrounding the tissue and brings in new blood supply to an area of diminished vascularity. So there's a brief history of note in the US and Europe. After the introduction of emergency obstetric services, the rates of fistula really plummeted. So this is kind of what fistula looks like in the US. Really, it's an iatrogenic issue during pelvic surgery that causes most of the issues. And our accepted incidence is about 0.1 to 0.2%. There are some risk factors that we have. Early damage to the bladder or the urinary trigone operatively is one of the main ones. Also radiation therapy or cancer patients, trauma, foreign bodies, and then IBD or other risk factors. But if we look at the kind of historical timelines, we are kind of, the developed nations are about 150 to 200 years behind us, and they have a lot of catching up to do. Here are some other etiologies that I found that we have here in the US that are also abroad. So trauma, sexual assault is one that is mentioned a lot for us. Neglected pessary, transurethral catheter replacement, excess sling tension on midurethral slings, other mesh, LGV, PID, syphilis, and urinary tuberculosis. Fun fact about urinary TB is the highest prevalence is actually in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, for all you Minnesotans out there. So what do we do now? We know that 12% will heal just with sustained catheterization alone. And most data notes that if this hasn't healed over about 4 weeks, it's likely to heal over. There's basically a lot of data also we have that shows that fistula size and healing is kind of, we don't know for sure here. And there was in 2003 a trial that looked at the use of fibrin sealants to kind of plug the hole and see if this would work. And unfortunately with that epithelialization that occurs, this was not effective, so we have stopped doing that. And here's some success rates that I found in the US and European literature, which show pretty much overall favorable success rates for these patients, especially if they're simple obstetrical in nature. I mean, a 90% is pretty decent. So it's really one of the things that we can actually work to treat. And I'm not going to go into a ton of the surgical treatment options, but really these are the fundamentals that everyone kind of should follow by. It's really accurately delineating what is the fistula and what is not, and then looking at the surrounding tissue and seeing how vascularized it is. Thinking about a timely repair is really important, and multi-layer to make sure if there is a failure of one layer, there's all other layers to hold in place. Making sure there's not a ton of tension, because obviously if there's a ton of tension between two things, it'll break apart more easily. And then focusing on post-operative bladder drainage. If the bladder is involved is really important as well, just to make sure that there isn't undue pressure that's placed on that. And here, there's a couple of classification schemes that I found. Go, who's an Australian surgeon who does a lot of obstetric fistula work in Tanzania, but also in a couple other sub-Saharan countries, devised this last classification scheme that I think is pretty interesting and helps a lot. It's pretty straightforward, which I like, and it goes and builds upon the Waldite criteria that was invented in about 1994, excuse me. So you can see here's a fistula. And this is a 2B fistula for everything that's on the child. So here's the external urethral meatus. They say that this is about like 2.78, I think is what they measured it as. So it would be in the 2 category. And then this is the hole itself. And you can see that they said it was like 2 to 2.5 in that range in the largest dimension. So that would fall into the B. And then they didn't comment upon the different special considerations, but really the things to think about are how fibrosed is it, and then is there any post-irradiative changes? Is there any ureteric involvement, which happens to up to 15% of cases? Is it circumferential? And then has this failed before? I think this is another issue for a lot of people. So this quote just stood out to me because I think it's just kind of a very poignant quote, and we all are here to kind of prepare and help kind of make the world more equal, and this to me seems like a place of a lot of improvement. Like I said before, in the US and Europe, we've dealt with a lot of these issues. We still have a ways to go, but we've dealt with a lot of them, and a lot of other countries we have not. And there's about 55 countries that have the highest maternal mortality, and these are the countries that actually have the highest rates of obstetric fistula. So before we delve into the discussion of obstetric fistula, it's imperative to discuss the context of maternal mortality worldwide. So rates of maternal mortality really vary very widely. South Sudan, with a high fragile state index, has a chance of dying in childbirth about 1 in 6, which is unacceptable. And in Northern Europe, it's about 1 in 30,000, so there's a huge variation in the scheme there. And while I think I'm talking just about the obstetric fistula, I think kind of we can encompass this in that larger discussion. This is a pie chart that I found from the WHO on what a lot of women are dying from in pregnancy. As you can see, they're focusing a lot on the hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, which is not what I will be focusing on. But you can see that there is a 9% who die of obstetric complications, including obstructed labor. This translates into about 300 million women a year who develop complications from pregnancy, and 1 woman a minute dies. And of these maternal mortality statistics, one big estimate that I found showed that 20 to 50 women will have chronic medical conditions secondary to their pregnancy. Some of the issues and some of the residual disabilities that I found included stress urinary incontinence, anemia, infertility, uterovaginal prolapse, and chronic pain. So this is an estimated 15 million women worldwide who are affected by chronic morbidity due to childbirth. All right, the first 2 census that was really done that looked at obstetric fistula was in about 2013. It was done by the Fistula Foundation. Previous to this, we really had kind of sparse intermittent data that was based on self-reported surveys rather than actual collection. And it noted that really there were 2 million women who had untreated obstetric fistula in Africa and Southeast Asia. Like I said before, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia are the areas that have the highest maternal mortality and subsequently have the highest rates of this. On average, there's about 50 to 100,000 annual cases, and that is only the ones that are seen and documented. And then the UNFPA also notes that in areas with a fragile state index, where there's not access to good maternal care, the rates of fistulization can be 2 to 3 per 1,000 deliveries, which is pretty high. So where is this mainly? So this is the global fistula map. This takes on the census data and then kind of brings in the different kind of levels and the prevalence of fistula in different areas. The dark blue is actually the highest affected. Lighter blue is less affected, and you can see actually the white is there's no data. So there's large chunks of the world that we just don't have data for. The cool thing about this map is kind of superimposed on it is where do we have our fistula centers, and you can see based on prevalence where there are some. So these that are kind of the dark purple, almost maroonish, have a higher prevalence of fistula operating centers, and then gray have less. So this is a schematic. I apologize, it's a little busy, but it kind of incorporates everything that I wanted to talk about. And I ran into this a lot of times during my research. As you can see, there's really a multifactorial etiology to this, and the social determinants of health play a large role in this. So I'm going to really focus on these red box topics, just because I feel like there is some pertinent details that we can go over with this. But it is a kind of a Venn diagram, and these all play and affect each other well. And then the main things I also wanted to focus on from the staff is the issues down here. So these are kind of what happens and what causes fistula, and this is what's secondary to that. And there's a lot of issues. I mean, 93% of fetuses are stillborn with these patients, and not only do they have a fistula, now they have to cope with that kind of loss. They have all these complex urologic injuries, they have scarring, stenosis, infertility, they have musculoskeletal and foot drop secondary to lumbosacral plexus injuries. They have a chronic skin irritation because they are losing urine, and there's a lot of issues there. They have odor, so a lot of people don't want to be near them. They have fecal incontinence, and then this is kind of the crux of the issue is there's a ton of stigmatization, loss of social support, poverty, and malnutrition that plays into this as well. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was antenatal care. I found this really great infographic by the WHO focusing on kind of what they have. As you can see here, it just highlights once again the 2 really differing rates of maternal mortality. So the WHO recommends a minimum of 4 antenatal visits, and for optimum outcome, they really actually just increased it to 8 visits. And a WHO study notes that about 86% of women globally get at least one antenatal care visit. There are about 62% who receive 4 antenatal care visits. In sub-Saharan Africa, this goes down to about 52%. In South Asia, it's about 46%. And the one other thing I wanted to mention is the appropriateness of care. So a study by UNFPA notes that of women who have complications in pregnancy, only 20% of them receive the appropriate quality care that they need. So it's not only access to care, it's also quality care that is needed. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was the cost expenditure of healthcare. We in the US are very familiar with this. It's also in other parts of the country and in the world. So in Tanzania, for instance, the data that I saw that was based on 2016 showed that an emergency C-section was about $135. And this is all out of pocket by the patient and their family. And then an average annual salary is about $115. So you can see there is a kind of discordance there with regards to if you need care, are you even able to get the care or pay for it? So there's an urban-rural divide. There's also a socioeconomic status divide. And this is seen a lot by the statistics that are found in Bangladesh. We see that poverty has a direct impact on attendance at delivery, appropriateness of care, and accessibility to care. The study that was done here by Engender Health looked at who attended what deliveries and noted that higher SES women were more likely to deliver with higher trained clinicians instead of family members or community health workers. And the community health workers really had about a 6-week training course and had seen usually on average about like 5 to 7 deliveries. So there's really kind of a huge, wide dearth of information and training levels in place. And then I wanted to highlight a few other things here. First off, that 92% of these women delivered at home, and that was secondary to really not being able to access care and also cultural implications of medical delivery. And the 2% cesarean rate, which seems really striking to me. And then looking at by level of care and also by how much care received, the rates of fistula actually were markedly different. So really 43% of women did not have fistula versus 18 if you had antenatal care visits. So there's a direct difference. Another issue that was found was the issue of early marriage. This is a topic that has always been kind of fascinating for me, and I've translated a few papers on it. But really, 15 million girls annually will marry before they're age 18. And this really, I kind of tend to focus on it from the economic implication side, but there is obviously the cultural and educational side as well of this. So really this is kind of a reduced productivity thing for the most part, because these women are not able to attend secondary school for the most part after they are married. And there's also the unmet need for contraception in this population as well. So there's a relative risk of about 5 for early marriage and pregnancy before age 18. So really why is early marriage still a thing? There's a couple of different reasons. It's a cultural issue, also an economic issue, but culturally there's the kind of concern for premarital promiscuity, things along those lines, and the economic impetus of getting a dowry. So those play into a lot of the things. And then there was a bank estimate that I saw that said that secondary to early marriage, there will be, they said trillions. I tried to narrow it down to how many trillion, couldn't really find that, but they did say that there are trillions of dollars in lost productivity by 2030 secondary to this. And this was just a really cool graphic that I found from India that was saying kind of, what are we doing to help combat that? So I just love that. And then what are the kind of the physiologic impacts of this? Because we all know people are still developing earlier in their teenage years. So a study by Wall and al. Looked at pelvic maturity and noted that this was probably around finally gained about 3 years after full height. So approximately around 18. Note that this is after you've been married for a lot of these women. Coupled with the fact that these women are usually lower socioeconomic stunted, they also are chronically malnourished and growth stunted. These impacts are actually magnified even further than this. So there was another study that looked at the rates of cephalopelvic disproportion and showed that there was about a 2 to a 10-fold increase if women were less than 145 centimeters. For those of you who aren't metric, this is about 4'9" which does seem pretty small, but is kind of close to the average height for a lot of these women if there's significant growth stunting secondary to malnutrition. And then another thing I found, so I found some data on Ethiopia and Nigeria, which have kind of more robust data systems. It shows that about 30% of fistula patients are pregnant before age 15, and about 50% before age 18. All right, sorry, I know this slide is not one of my favorites, but I think it is also really important. So this is another tradition that I found that increased the rates of obstetric fistula, and it's FGM. Here are a few of the practices that I found. The papers that I found doing these specific things were a little older, so my hope is that they've been kind of starting to get phased out, but this is still a persistent issue in a lot of the world. The WHO notes that FGM is identified in about 10% of fistula patients and rises to about 30% with the causa practice of vitiated cutting and obstructed labor. There's a couple other estimates I found that showed that obstructed labor and coupled with FGM explains up to like 15 to 20%. I wanted to delve into just what these things actually mean really quickly because I think they were just interesting. So in Nigeria, there is this causa practice, which is called vitiated cutting, and basically what it is bless you, a large knife that goes up through the vaginal introitus to the anterior bone. You can see that this would directly impact the urethra. In Nigeria, sorry Stephanie, your face doesn't look really great right now. In Nigeria as well, there was a practice that I found where they had a kind of an early iron. They would heat that up by the fire and they would iron out the perineum to see if that would actually increase stretching. It did not, in fact. And then they would birth in the squatting position. Yeah. And then in Qatar, I found another postpartum one this time, which showed they would pack the vagina with these kind of egg-sized balls of rock salt in the postpartum period to see if they could kind of shrink the vagina back down, which led to a lot of chronic vaginal irritation and also increased visualization rates. So this is kind of the main issue for me. Fistula is not something that someone can live with. It's pretty much a social calamity and an ostracization today. Sorry, I can't say that word. So these are teenage women for the most part. They're uneducated. Many of them are in rural places. They don't have any social support. They're away from their family. They don't have any education. They don't have any connection or money. And 80% of these women are actually abandoned by their husbands at this point in time. The rate decreases if the women come into the marriage with money, but it's still not high. And so then they're left with kind of what do they do for work. So 20% of them beg. There is an increased rate of commercial sex work in these women, and there's also very high suicidality. But really, there's a lot of issues. There's a really sad story that I found where one woman who was not abandoned by her husband was actually forced to live in a hut that was on the outskirts of their rural property without a door so that the hyenas could get her at night because it was easier to dispose of the body than actually just killing her while he took on a new family. So, moving on from that and thinking about healthcare infrastructure, this is a schematic I like a lot, and it's used by a lot of consultants. The WHO notes that there's basically kind of 3 delays to delayed services. It's in obstetrical, also in subspecialty care, other subspecialty care. So really there's a delay in kind of the community and the social cultural factors. There's a delay in receiving adequate care at the facility, and then there's a delay there's just kind of adequate and appropriate treatment. So I kind of I'm trying to just go over all 3 of them at once, but just go more with the phase 3 actions. There's some other kind of barriers to accessing fistula repair that I found throughout the literature. This was a Ghanaian study that I found. It was a lit review of 137 papers, and it talked about what were the issues for many of these fistula patients. And prior to their repairs, these women had gone to, on average, 3.7 different hospitals to seek care. But really psychosocial issues, kind of like we touched on, social issues like we touched on, the political issues, if there is infrastructure for it, some awareness issues, are there fistula hospitals, do we know about them? Transportation issues are huge, and also care quality. But the one that came up the most in about 85 of 137 of the studies was actually financial issues, and that kind of iterates throughout this talk. So cost of surgery is something we struggle with here. It's our top source of bankruptcy. However, we have some insurance here. In a lot of places, they don't have any. For the World Bank, in sub-Saharan Africa, about 70% of healthcare financing is actually out of pocket, which leads to a higher likelihood of selling and buying assets for these things. And so there's a pretty fragile health ecosystem. And these were some of the costs that I found, which seemed very low to us, but I recognize that a lot of these people are living on less than $1 a day. So for a non-complicated malaria, it's about $5 for treatment, rises to around $300 if someone is to have cerebral malaria with any neurologic sequelae. But really it's about $450 to $600 for a fistula repair. And there's a lot of kind of hidden costs in this as well. Which you can see that this would be kind of an obstruction of care, but physical rehab is very important, and kind of correcting the malnutrition that exists in a lot of these people even before operating is a huge thing. Daily food, these hospitals don't provide care, so that's another thing to think about. Child care, if there are any previous children that are living, and other things along those lines. So this is kind of just an infographic of what I just said. And this was another quote I found from one of the papers that was just talking about it. And it really kind of encapsulates to me the fact that these women are at home ostracized and unable to work or get any jobs because of the chronic offensive odor that they're emanating. So that's that. So kind of to get to the crux of what we can do. And you can see this is kind of a multifaceted issue with a lot of social determinants of health issues that are involved, and educational and social cultural implications. However, there are a lot of people who are working to correct this, and in the OB/GYN sphere, we can think of that kind of surgical capacity to fix these things. When we look at prevention of obstetric fistula, we show that about 75,000 new emergency obstetric centers of quality care would be noted solely in sub-Saharan Africa alone, and we don't have kind of the money for that at this point in time. And then there are a couple of different estimates I found. One estimate showed that with the current availability of surgeons in these areas, we'd have about 100 years to cure and tackle all of the fistula patients that are there right now, and that's without any new cases. But we're working on it. There are some new national frameworks. The first one was actually enacted in about 2015, I believe, and it looks at kind of prevention of fistula and seeing what we can do in the media to help with this. So I love this picture. So one of the other things at a forward-thinking place that I kind of think is doing great work is the Hamlin Fistula Center. And this was started by two fistula surgeons, Reg and Catherine Hamlin. And they emigrated to Addis in 1959. They initially intended to stay 1 year, and shocking, they're still there now. And were nominated for several Nobel Prizes because of their work with fistula. They recognized the need for obstetric care and to tackle obstetric fistula, and so started the Princess Tsai midwifery training school in about the 1970s, and then really focused a lot more on creating dedicated fistula hospitals. They say that they've cured about 60,000, and they employ only, for the most part, previous fistula patients, which I think is a great thing. And they also have a pretty low cost of repair because they've got the service down to about $350. And that includes the cost of physiotherapy, that includes nutrition pre-operatively as well as post-operatively. It includes a vocational retraining for a lot of these patients and education, given the limited education prior. New clothes for a lot of these patients, and then each of them, as you see, they're all wearing these blankets. I had no idea what these blankets were. But it's actually a blanket that is handmade by other fistula patients who are cured and signifies like their new life and their old life coming together, which I thought was cool. And then there's a couple other NGOs who are partnering to help. There's a ton of them actually, but these are a few of them. So the World Fistula Fund is one of them, IOWD, Freedom from Fistula, UNFPA campaigns, World Bank. There's the International Society of Fistula Surgeons, there's the Fistula Foundation, and Direct Relief as well. And there was a Lancet Commission on Global Surgery that discussed kind of the local infrastructure regarding NGOs as well. One of their direct quotes was that NGOs can play an important part of care delivery. And when using a measured approach consistent with local needs, culture, and context, NGOs can strengthen the system by assisting local clinicians in tackling the backlog of unmet need. And this is really needed because, I mean, even solely just in Ethiopia alone, there are an estimated 9,000 new cases. And per the government, per the health sector, they can fix about 1,200. So you can see there's a staggering difference between how many they can actually fix. And so looking at kind of what these places have done, the Fistula Foundation touts that as of May 2019, they've performed about 86,768 surgeries in 427 facilities across 57 countries that are hardest hit. The IOWD is a consortium that's through Brown, Johns Hopkins, UNM, and Northwestern. And they've helped with about 2,200 surgeries, but really what they've been focusing on more is to improve access to care for a lot of these patients and recognizing that 90% of low and middle income countries really do lack access to safe surgery, and that leaves about an estimated 5 billion people with no access to surgery. However, this is another thing I think that is a quick disclaimer. There's a lot of concerted effort that's being made to fix these things, but I think looking at the ethics and the sustainability of a lot of these global health programs is also very important. And there has been some pushback as well. I went through and did kind of a lit search and looked at how many of there's thousands of NGOs that are working on this, but there has been some kind of disastrous impact as well. And this is mainly because there's been lack of post-operative follow-up, or they've been unable to deal with the surgical complications. So Dr. Wall is an OBGYN who practiced for quite some time, also in sub-Saharan Africa, and then went back and got a degree in bioethics, stopped practicing OBGYN, now works at WashU, and is so focusing more on the social implications and things like that. So that's not mine, great. His thing is kind of inadequate training in fistula tourism that happens in a lot of these places. And then surgical availability, a lot of times we don't have the same tools that we would have here. But his kind of motto, his champions are to train low resource champions only if they intend to stay. You can say that this would be an issue if you train someone in an overstrained healthcare setting and then they leave right away. That's not a good use of money. And it's kind of strain the healthcare sector. Developing a local fistula champion, and then partnering with a lot of the Western medical institutions for research and faculty enhancement and residency training, but not solely just for performing the surgeries themselves. And then I think the one thing that he emphasized a lot of is fixing the whole woman and not just fixing the hole in the bladder, which is, I think, really important. That emotional consequences is very huge. So we have kind of a two-pronged approach that we need to do here, and we've talked about kind of how we can tackle the surgical backlog, but really prevention, I think, is key here, and we're trying to work on this as well. Ultimately, this was an MDG that we did, Millennium Development Goal, that we didn't meet, but it is a sustainable development goal we're working on, and there's a couple of different things that we're doing. we're improving national awareness about access to obstetric care. There's a lot of safe motherhood campaigns that are being enacted. Last I saw, there were like 57 new ones in the past 3 years, which is great. There's also the improvement in healthcare facilities across the worldwide. And then there's also advocacy on a lot of these issues that are being worked on. A couple of different papers I found also saw that really targeting education to the mother-in-law was actually the best way to increase access to services, because they're there at the time of delivery and are the ones who are actually the decision-making people. So that is, I think, a fascinating thing that people are working on. So in conclusion, this is an issue that we have, for the most part, dealt with in the US. We continue to work on some things, but we really have. But developing nations really continue to struggle with this. There's a lot of decreased economic productivity because of it and overburdening of the healthcare. And so really, like what happened in the US and in Europe about 150 to 175 years ago, access to emergency obstetric care really could help eradicate this issue. However, it's kind of a work in progress right now. These are just two things that I really liked. On PBS, I Walk to Beautiful. It's a great video about a lot of these obstetric fistula patients. And then this is a book that Hamlin wrote that I thought was really good. So we have a day to end obstetric fistula, because we have a day for everything. It's May 23rd. It'll be great. And any questions?
Questions, thoughts? I just have an editorial comment. I don't think it needs to be stated, but I'll state it anyway. This represents an amazing, horrible health disparity. Sure, developing nations, but, the United States is the only developing country with an increase in maternal mortality in the last 10 years. Not relevant to fistula so much, but the point being, we work in a field where it's so obvious that women are discriminated against, and in so many ways, and this is just cold. That's my editorial comment. Other questions or thoughts? Oh my God, this is such a quiet group. Dobes, what do you got for me? Dobie, Ethiopia fistulas, you do any over there?
No. I was only there for a week.
Okay.
So I like your talk. As you were giving it, in the back of my mind, I was hoping, please talk about medical tourism.
Yeah, it's a huge
We
thing.
make ourselves feel good that we go somewhere for a week and, fix, but who's taking care of those patients when we leave? So thank you for talking about that.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Watlett's not here, but I think she set up a great program, because we're going there to teach people how to take care of this, to make ourselves feel better. So I really like the program that this department has set up with Dr. Watlett. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and an editorial comment about that as well. As you know, Ethiopia right now is a level 3, meaning nobody from this department is going there with a level 3 thing going on. But we are holding steady with those folks who Cindy has done a beautiful job with building a long-term relationship with that medical community in Hawassa. So we're working on having them keep coming here while the dust settles. 60 people were killed in Addis about 3 months ago. Some riots or something, I don't know. It's a level 3. And so that's a problem, but waiting in the weeds, all the groundwork has been done. UW is committed to Ethiopia, and so are we. We've done Cindy, Nicholas, and now Jen Karnowski continue to do a great job with what's going on now. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah. Louder.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Hamlin Center does a good job of integrating women and having other professionals as their workforce.
Yeah.
But people across the other centers that are working on the integration outside of this itself.
I have, yeah. So there's a couple, So the question was focusing on abandonment and seeing if there are other centers who are working on reintegration of these women through vocational programs. There's a couple different ones. The main ones I found were centered in Ethiopia. But They're in McKellar. They have a pretty robust center. They're doing research there on looking at depression for fistula patients, also seeing what other vocational opportunities exist. So they're doing some there. There's some in Bahir Dar, and in about 4 other sites they're working on that. They're trying to expand that and taking that to Uganda as well. And then in Bangladesh, there was also one other retraining program I found. So they're working on it. I think it's just really hard, and it isn't very well publicized. Yes?
I just reviewed a paper within last month that's going to be coming out talking about a different part of Africa where they're actually involving the whole family.
That's great.
Yeah. And how to reintegrate them and what the family can do to help out.
Thanks. Yeah, that's incredibly important.
Yeah, Elle.
So great talks here.
Good.
Really well put together. A nice comprehensive book. My question is a little bit more prevention.
Yeah.
So obviously it's the prevention of obstetric labor.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, in your reading, something I've been reading a lot about is this concept of training for obstetric emergencies.
Mhm.
So obviously obstetricians are trained for obstetric emergencies. But maternity care providers the world over, midwives, family physicians,
Yeah.
general surgeons, like it's sort of a group of people, lay midwives, certified midwives, and so forth. So I'm just wondering if you cross anything that is sort of like this common pathway for training for obstetrics and emergencies that is almost like like some kind of certification or something. Because it strikes me that we've got this issue where most obstetrics is without medical incident. It's low risk, it's natural, it's lovely, it's wonderful. We want it in the home, that's what we want for all women. And yet this small percent where things will arrive is not easily predicted. So I'm just wondering if you come across anything, an initiative like specifically like that. You know what I'm trying to say?
I do, and there's a couple different things that I found out. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but basically, so the also courses, they've modified those that a lot of the family med people do here. So they've modified and distilled those down for community health workers. The ones that they had was they had a postpartum hemorrhage drill that basically they had these, they call them party pants in one thing, but basically what it is, and I don't have the exact term, but basically it has simulates an obstetric hemorrhage. You put them on, and there's either water or Kool-Aid or anything that comes out, and so you go through the steps of a hemorrhage. So that was one thing.
Also
Yeah. So they've distilled that out.
I don't
Different.
need so much training. I need sort of certification.
Oh, the certification. I think they're still working on.
Program,
Yeah, in India they have a few different credentialing bodies, and I think it also depends on which country you're in, because the certification for like a community health worker will differ between different countries, and so that is the one thing that changes. I think it's all in the national framework, really.
We can talk a little more.
I'd love to.
Yeah, one more question, Mary.
So on the slides of prevention, I'll take one step even earlier. Your one big slide is summarized,
Yeah.
you see all the places, the red boxes that you put on for marriage.
Yeah.
And then, just a fast, I can't remember, but in between early marriage doesn't necessarily mean early pregnancy, and I have to say contraception.
Yeah.
And I understand financial impact of early marriage and getting your daughters out, receiving a dowry.
Yeah.
However, there is a lot of work that can and should be done, in my opinion, to help cultures, communities, and families understand that early pregnancy in a teen woman because of early marriage isn't necessarily economically advantageous for that family, for that community, or for that.
Point taken.
Yeah, they've looked at a few of those, and for every additional year of secondary schooling, their rate of early marriage goes down by about 6%.
Yep.
I can't talk anymore, but they are looking at that as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah.